properly identified during our open forum. Also, for those who are having difficulty with their internet connection, we'd like to request you to disable your videos so that you can improve the bandwidth consumption. There are also buttons in the Zoom settings where you can access that and share non-verbal feedback. We can appreciate you sharing likes and hearts so that we can inspire our speakers to also get more engaged with your reactions and feedback. As mentioned, you are welcome to share your questions and comments and feedback in the chat box. And during our open forum, we will encourage all of you to speak directly, or if not possible, we are going to go to the questions in the chat. Now, if you don't have time for all of the questions, we will try to reach out to our speakers so that they can get back to you with their responses to the questions you've submitted. I hope everybody is safe and well. There are parts of the country that is currently undergoing this Typhoon Kiko. We hope everybody is keeping safe. In Metro Manila and other parts of the country, the pandemic is still raging, and I hope that you are taking the necessary precaution. We also expect several participants from outside the Philippines, so we encourage everybody when you participate to speak in English. So this event is sponsored by the Group Advisory Council for the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group of the PNP, ACE and Associates, the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, Security Matters, Resilient PH, Arslan SRS, ASIS International, and the Network for the Prevention of Extremism in the Philippines. Before we begin our program, from the personal perspective, I think what we're doing today is a very important activity. As we have seen time and again, those who were not there to witness the actual events or those who were not part of that timeline would probably not really know much about the happenings that transpired before, during, and after 9/11. So it's important for us to keep on going back to this and learning from the lessons of history, especially for the younger generations. And coming into election year 2022 for the Philippines, it's important that we start the discussions so that our efforts to build up our resilience against human-induced disasters can also be put in place as we look for the next set of leaders to usher us into the new era of Philippine in terms of security and peace. Let's do a check of our feedback mechanism. Can everybody try to click on the thumbs up emoji on Zoom? Okay, I'm seeing some there. Okay, good. Would be interesting to go back to these buttons every now and then so you get to exercise your multitasking skills. So while listening, also reacting with our buttons. Thank you, everybody. We also have participants from the Philippine media. Welcome, guys. It's important that you are covering this event. We hope that you can share the lessons and the insights that will be shared by our speakers, because as I mentioned, these are important so that the new generation, the next generation, can keep up, with our efforts to combat terrorism and extremism. Again, we'd like everybody to please make the necessary changes to your names in the profile. We'd appreciate having your names and your organization flash there for better reference and so that we can address you properly in our Q&A forum. Also, if you're going to raise your hands later on, please also be mindful to lower them after your question has been addressed. For this webinar, we're expecting a lot of our professionals and executives from the private and public sector in the security and peace front, but we also expect a lot of other stakeholders to participate, as this particular issue is not limited to the security and peace profession industry. All of us have a stake in this. Looking at the faces that I can see from your videos, it seems like all of us have been around during 9/11 20 years ago. Um, unless I'm mistaken in assessing faces, maybe there's a handful here who weren't born yet at that time. So again, for the information of everybody, this webinar is brought to you by the Group Advisory Council of the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group of the PNP, the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, ACE and Associates, Security Matters, Resilient.ph, Arslan SRS, ASIS International, and the Network for the Prevention of Extremism in the Philippines. Also, for reference, we are recording this session, and after the session, we will be sharing the edited version for your future consumption. Okay. Good morning again, everybody, and welcome to Investigating and Detecting Terrorist Threats in the Philippines, Lessons Learned 20 Years After 9/11 and the Afghanistan Connection. To formally give us the welcome remarks, please welcome the chairman of the GAC-CIDG, Mr. Marcelo Torres.
Good morning. Let me extend my warm wishes on behalf of the CIDG Advisory Council. I want to convey my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Sidney Jones, founder of Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, and Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, Chairman, Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, for accepting our invitation to speak in this forum. Thank you, HIPS. Madamo nga salamat to Mr. Augusto Cesar Esmeralda, ACE and Associates Risk Management Incorporated, Security Matters, Resilient Philippines, ASIS International, a Philippine Chapter Network for the Prevention of Violence, Extremism in the Philippines. And of course, this worthy endeavor will not be possible without the support of CIDG or Criminal Investigation Group Director, Police Major General Albert Ignatius Ferro. I welcome the participants of this forum from the nationwide members of the CIDG units. Also, I would like to acknowledge the attendance of General Ed Galang and to the many in attendance of this forum nationwide. Today marks the 20th year, the 9/11 devastating event that changed the face of air travel and dramatic transportation security changes. In this forum, our resource persons will be talking about the impact of 9/11 and the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan, what lies ahead, and the implication of terrorist threats locally and globally. So again, welcome everyone to a fruitful forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Torres. Okay, again, going back, let's try our reaction button. Can we give Chairman Torres a round of applause, please? Okay, fantastic. At this point, we'd like to share with us his opening remarks. The Director of the CIDG of the Philippine National Police, Police Major General Albert Ignatius Ferro.
Thank you, Wally, to our MC. 26 years ago, Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or known as KSM, the co-author of the 9/11 attacks, hatched an ambitious yet deadly terror attack in Doña Josefa apartment, Quirino Avenue, Manila, Philippines. It is known now as the Bomb Factory. And I witnessed the unfolding investigation events. A safe and pleasant day to all, and thank you so much for everyone's presence. I am also delighted to be here. What a wonderful day this is, and I am so happy to be sharing it with all of you, even at such a distance. To our organizer, led by Professor or Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, our Executive Director of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, Terrorism Research, Ace, to my Mista, Ace Esmeralda, the President of CPP, of ACE and Associate Risk Management Incorporated, to our abled and distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Sidney Jones, Madam, the Group Advisory Council of CIDG, led by Dr. Marcelo Torres, sir, I am genuinely thankful to you for bringing up the question, and I quote, "What have we learned 20 years after 9/11, and what about the Afghanistan connection?" Unquote. Really, where have we gone 2 decades after the 9/11 attacks in the United States of America? But then some may also ask, why 9/11? Did this not happen in New York City, that is 13,000 kilometers away? 6 years prior to 9/11 attacks, on January 6, 1995, I and my team investigated a small chemical fire in Doña Josefa apartment in Quirino Avenue, Manila, that eventually led to the discovery of bombs, bomb-making manuals, and computers that contain the details of a complex terrorist plot. After a month-long series of painstaking debriefing and document exploitation, we uncovered a plot to assassinate the Pope and a file called Project Bujinka. Bujinka, which is literally translated to terror from the sky, was supposed to be a large-scale terrorist attack planned by Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to blow up 11 US airliners over the Pacific. Their plan was to sneak liquid explosive called nitroglycerin inside the airplanes, where it can later be assembled in a comfort room with a simple Casio watch calculator. Left undiscovered, this could have been the worst terrorist attack in the US history. As a result, I became a principal witness in the trial of Ramzi Youssef in the United States. In September 5, 1996, Youssef was convicted and was sentenced to 240 years of imprisonment, and efforts were recognized by no less than the United States President Bill Clinton, who wrote a letter to our President Fidel Valdez Ramos, praising the Philippine National Police and our role in preventing the airline terror attack. Bujinka is significant because it is one of the many terrorist plots that can be traced back to the Philippines. Through sheer investigative work, Project Bujinka died, but the dream of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed never faded. This very same investigation led to the discovery of a disturbing evidence of a subsequent massive terror plot by Al-Qaeda against the United States known today as the September 11 attack or 9/11. Ladies and gentlemen, terrorism may take in many forms, but I had but one realization over the years. Terrorism is borderless and ruthless. It is neither bound by borders, nor does it choose its victims. 2 decades have passed since September 11, 2001, and we saw how this changed the perception of the world towards terrorism. Somehow, the grand scheme of Al-Qaeda against the US became a catalyst, fired back tenfold. Governments began to recognize the threat of terrorism and sought to understand its root causes, adopt more effective policies, and become more aware of its global consequences. It leads further to a more global threat, thus global cooperation sprouted. Our country and people also suffered extensively because of the broken ideologies and extreme worldviews. The 5-decade-old armed struggle of communist terrorists and the secessionist struggle in the far south already cost tens of thousands of Filipino lives, not to mention their impact on society and the economy. An article entitled Counterterrorism in the Philippines, Review of Key Issues, written by Ronald U. Mendoza et al., presented data from the University of Maryland Global Terrorism Database that suggested that 4,943 terrorist attacks occurred in the Philippines from 2004 to 2018. On top of this, the paper cited an observed evolution of attacks in the country due to the occurrence of suicide bombings from 2018 to 2019. In this adversity, however, I believe that we have found our opportunity to reconsider our ways and become better in dealing with the global conundrum. To cite a few developments, in 2001, Republic Act 9160, or the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2001, was enacted. This empowered us to go after criminals and terrorists who laundered money from their unlawful activities. We are now empowered to cut their lifeline, their bloodline. In 2005, the PNP established the Philippine Bomb Data Center that serves as a coordinating body to provide technical assistance, operational support, enhancement of training and strategic information on all unlawful use of explosives, both domestic and international incidents. As we are all aware, the terrorist weapon of choice are bombs. Incidentally, yours truly was the founding chief of the Philippine Bomb Data Center and went on to serve there for almost 4 years. And we recognize from all the bomb centers around the world that information sharing is vital. That's why sometimes 2006, we ink an information sharing protocol for all the bomb data center in the world to share the different signatures of IEDs and to be on call at any time so that we could share in preventing and investigating these terrorist attacks. In 2007, Republic Act 9731, or the Human Security Act of 2007, was enacted. The law became the Philippines' first and principal law against terrorism, but was never fully utilized. It was a weak law and perceived to be favoring more on the criminals and the terrorists. In 2018, Executive Order Number 70, or institutionalizing the whole of nation approach in attaining inclusive and sustainable peace in creating the National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict, or NTF-LCAC, was enacted and activated. This effectively addressed the dire need to end terrorist activities of the CPP, NPA, NDF that plagued our country for 5 decades. Last year, in 2020, Republic Act 1147-9, or the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020, was enacted. This law repealed Republic Act 9731, empowered the Anti-Terrorism Council, the security sector as a whole in dealing with terrorism. Why I'm telling you this? Fighting terrorism is not as simple as search and destroy. Ace and me know how. We've been fighting the CPP NPA when we were young lieutenants. Mine is an advocacy of saving innocent lives. Terrorism is not just a simple incident or a series of incidents. It is a complex set of phenomena that spans multiple spaces, multiple places, groups of people, cultures, beliefs, roots, and causes. And don't be misled. The attacks, bombings, and killings are merely symptoms of terrorism and not the essence of terrorism. It is a compound of causes that develop into webs of plots and operation designed by capable and highly educated people. As Professor Deepak Gupta puts it, ideas, good or evil, however, do not spread spontaneously. They require leadership, often backed by deep pockets of financial support. When messages of threats from overarching enemy resonate with a large number of people, a movement of violence is born. And what about Afghanistan? We have seen in recent days the rather unwelcome developments in Afghanistan. With the US armed forces out of the region and the Taliban reestablishing their power, have we asked the question, what is in it for us? Have we considered the implication of the event halfway around the world? It is more unfortunate that there's no simple answer to the global crisis on terrorism, but there is always hope. With the development in our legal system, in the security sector, in the structure of government collaboration, and in technology, I can confidently say that compared with 2 decades ago, we are now better equipped in addressing terror, but we cannot expect to go against it alone. We need the support of the global community. Global cooperation is crucial in dealing with terrorism. Thus, I appeal to everyone participating in this forum today. We have remarkable speakers who went out of their way just to share their insights on terrorism. Of course, Madam Dr. Sidney Jones, the founder of the Institute Policy Analysis Conflict, and my good buddy, Dr. Rommel, Banlaoi, the chairman of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, Terrorism Research. Lend them your undivided attention and learn. Now, more than ever, we need to support the security sector in unfolding the rule of law by implementing NTF-ELCAC and the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020. We have already gained the momentum. We just strive harder to support the government with its holistic approach strategy in addressing root causes of conflicts. We will surely succeed in vanquishing the terrorist broken ideology. And may I quote an English poet, W.B. Yeats, wrote a beautiful piece a century ago, and it goes, and I quote, "Had I the heavens embroidered clothes and wrote with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark clothes of night and light and the half light, I would spread the clothes under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly because you tread on my dreams," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, across the 7,641 islands of the Philippines, Families, men, women, and children rely on us to keep the peace. Let us be firm, first in our resolve to end these long and costly conflicts in our land. Our people have laid their dreams under our feet. Let us tread softly because we tread on their dreams. A pleasant morning to all. Mabuhay po tayong lahat.
Thank you very much, Police Major General Albert Ignatius Ferro. Indeed, this terrorism knows no borders and they chooses no one. It's a continuing global threat, and that all of us need to work together in order to address this, anchored on information sharing. We are truly inspired with your sharing of your personal experiences through the years. And it's also very heartening to know the strides that the Philippines has gotten into in terms of the fight against this. Personally, I was happy to note of the accomplishments that you have outlined, including the development of legislation relative to the counterterrorism efforts and the efforts at the Philippine Bomb Data Center. Thank you very much, Police Major General Ferro, and we will expect to hear more from him in our open forum. At this point, we are going to start with our formal sharing from our speakers. So our first speaker had the graces to join and participate in this in spite of the changes, variation in time. So allow me to give you a brief background for our first speaker. Our speaker is the founder director of Jakarta-based Institute for Policy Analysis on Conflict. 2002 to 2013, she has with the International Crisis Group, first at Southeast Asia Project Director, then from 2007 as Senior Advisor to the Asia Program. Before joining the Crisis Group, she worked for the Ford Foundation in Jakarta and New York, Amnesty International in London, and as the Indonesia Philippines Pacific Research Human Rights Watch in New York as the Asia Director. She holds a bachelor's and a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and she received an honorary doctorate from the New School in New York. She is an expert on security in Southeast Asia, particularly Islamic terrorist movements in Indonesia. She has also examined separatist conflicts in Aceh, Papua, and Mindanao, communal conflicts in Poso, Moluccas, and ethnic conflicts in Kalimantan. She has also studied Islamic radicalism, producing reports on the Jemaah Islamiyah and its operations in Indonesia and the Philippines, as well as issues of security sector reform and decentralization in Indonesia. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very fortunate to have with us for this morning Dr. Sidney Jones. Dr. Jones, take it.
Thank you very much. And let me say how much I appreciated those remarks of Major General Ferro, because not only was it very important to underscore the way in which the Bojinka plot really did provide the first steps toward 9/11, but also I think it's important to recognize how much progress there has been, not just in the Philippines, but elsewhere in the region. And it's made this region of Southeast Asia a very different place, and I think a more secure place than it was 20 years ago. May we have the slides, please? So what I'd like to do is discuss a bit about some of the lessons learned and some of the achievements that have taken place. I should just say, though, that I'm sitting here in New York. I moved back from Jakarta in June, and it's September, and it's exactly the same kind of weather that it was in 9/11 when I was working in the Empire State Building, and the windows of our conference room looked straight out at the World Trade Center. And we were evacuated then after the second plane hit. So just being here in the city and seeing the same kind of glorious September morning brings it all back about what that day was like. First slide, please. So as we see the Taliban return to power, I think there are all sorts of issues that come up for what this means for Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of sensationalist reporting and fears that somehow this immediately makes the terrorist threat rise in the region. I think it's too early to say what the immediate impact will be, but I think that at least in the short term, we shouldn't panic because there are some developments in place that make the recurrence of what took place in this region immediately after 9/11 very different than what I think we will experience going forward. But I think one of the main lessons is that the risk of terrorism increases when you have local and transnational incentives come together to undertake violence. And we could see that in Marawi, the incentives of the Maute brothers and some of the others who took part with the broader goals of ISIS. We saw that at different points with Al-Qaeda and Jamaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, and we could see it again as new movements emerge. But that's what's really important to watch as we think about what could happen in the Philippines going forward. Next. This presentation will cover three themes. One is what conditions in the past have given rise to terrorism in the Philippines, with a particular focus on the last 20 years. What's the current status of terrorist groups in the Philippines and Indonesia? Because in a way, I think the fates of those two countries are linked as far as extremism is concerned. Less so Malaysia, but Malaysia as a transit country and as a place where people go through Sabah to pass from Indonesia to Mindanao. I think Malaysia is also very critical, also because of the support network for Abu Sayyaf among the Suluk population in Malaysia. And then third, what are the possible future scenarios that could bring Afghanistan and Southeast Asia back together? Next. So if we look at the conditions that have given rise to terrorism in the Philippines, I've put together a few of those conditions, but it's not exhaustive, and I'm sure you all could add to this list. But one of the things that's striking about terrorism in the Philippines is how much it was affected by fugitives looking for safe havens. We can think of Ramzi Youssef, we can think of Marwan, we can think of a range of other people, but when they came to the Philippines and managed to get into the Philippines, it changed the nature of the terrorist threat enormously. Secondly, we need to think about vengeance and government actions that spark retaliatory attacks. Now, we've got a number of examples of these kinds of actions. Everything from the killing of leaders like Dr. Abu and Gaddafi Janjalani to other kinds of airstrikes that led to retaliatory attacks on the AFP. And we see that same phenomenon of vengeance emerge basically wherever terrorism takes place. It's a hugely important motivating force. Then, as I mentioned, we've seen a push in the global jihad coinciding with local dynamics to create new possibilities for terrorism. We've seen instances where the breakdown of local alliances led one partner in that alliance to look for another partner. And that led to regrouping and sometimes to greater militancy of the new group. We also see throughout the region, and I'm sure this is true around the world as well, where you have personal rivalries among commanders leading to a kind of one-upsmanship where one commander wants to outdo another by undertaking a bigger, more high-profile attack. And in a way, this is what's characterized the competition among Abu Sayyaf leaders just within the Philippines itself, just within Sulu itself. But it's also been characteristic of, for example, in Afghanistan, the competition between the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban with ISIS Khorasan. We didn't have that attack on Kabul airport just out of the blue. It was a direct message from ISIS to Al-Qaeda and their Taliban backers in the past that we are a player and we are going to try and take advantage of this situation as well. And we are your enemy. So that kind of competition can drive terrorism in any country, but it has driven terrorism in the Philippines as well. And finally, I think the narrative that was very clearly present at the time of Marawi and that has been a driver for recruitment across Mindanao is still very much present, that Mindanao, especially Muslim Mindanao, has been characterized by neglect, discrimination, and brutality. That's the narrative at the hands of the government. And this has given rise to a receptivity to ideologies that stress social justice. And that includes many of the extremist ideologies. So I know at some level there's been a downplaying of the importance of ideology, especially in the Philippines, and a focus on material incentives and so on. But in fact, that narrative is still with us, and it is still going to make many people in Muslim Mindanao receptive to recruitment into extremist movements. Next. So let me just mention the fugitive issue, because as I say, I think this has been critical, more so for the Philippines than for Indonesia. We don't get very many international fugitives fleeing to Indonesia because they would stand out so much. But in the Philippines, partly because there are many pockets in Mindanao where state control is very weak, fugitives over the years have found a safe haven. And one of the things that happens when they come in is that they can bring expertise, leadership, motivation, and funding channels. So I agree wholeheartedly with Major General Ferro that there's been huge progress through the Anti-Money Laundering Act and for in many other ways. I think immigration has improved enormously in terms of vigilance, but there still is this issue of people seeking shelter in Mindanao. And it raises the question of why can't we get in the region or even more globally a shared watch list of suspects? And we don't have that yet. And I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. And it's just worth thinking about why. I think one of the big reasons is that there's a fear of leakage and that you can't keep a list of suspects secure enough to allow a police force in one country to be willing to share a watch list with colleagues even when there's a need to work together. There's a particular distrust, I think, of the Interpol, not so much on their database, but specifically in terms of sharing information on terrorists, and the fear that it's too open and too many people can get access to it. There are also legal and bureaucratic barriers. In some places, the legal difficulties of sharing personal data of people that haven't been convicted of a crime is a real concern, even when they're being sought for a particular crime. And in some cases, there are simply too many bureaucratic obstacles to get through the chain of command to enable that information sharing to take place. Also, one of the things that I saw in Indonesia when I lived there was that there was a very strong sense of nationalism, that we didn't want to share information and give information on our citizens, even if they were bad guys, to another country where we couldn't control the outcome of what would happen if our citizen was arrested. And that kind of nationalism kicks in to some degree in Malaysia as well, but it's also another obstacle against putting a shared watch list together. I think, as I mentioned, though, despite all those obstacles, there's been real, genuine improvement and progress in contacts among all of the countries in the region, but particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And I think there's been particular progress on the immigration side. At the time of Marawi, when all these Indonesians were trying to get to Marawi, it turned out the immigration had a very simple test for people trying to get in, both through harbors and through airports. And it was, do they speak English? And did they have a hotel booking? And if the answer to both was no, they were deported. And it turned out they caught a lot of people with simply those two questions. So it didn't need a lot of training of the immigration officials, but it did manage to catch some of the people who wanted to join Marawi. Next. I mentioned vengeance as a motivation. I think one of the most striking examples of this was the MILF Special Forces unit joining forces with JI to basically avenge Estrada's all-out war in 2000. Now, this clearly preceded the 9/11, so it's a kind of precursor to some of the terrorist attacks that took place afterwards. But when we had the Rizal Day bombing of the LRT in Manila, that was a direct retaliatory attack for the all-out war on Camp Abu Bakr. Likewise, when we had the attack in Jakarta on the Philippine ambassador there, that was also a direct act of vengeance. And we've seen many other examples of terrorism attacks motivated by the need to get even, or the desire to get even for a particular act that killed members of the extremist group itself. One question in Indonesia now is Jemaah Islamiyah, and I'll talk more about Jemaah Islamiyah in a moment, but that's the only group in this region that was directly connected, the only group in Indonesia that was directly connected to Al-Qaeda, although it was never under the direct control of Al-Qaeda. Obviously, the Abu Sayyaf also had its connections to Al-Qaeda. But we've seen in the last 2 years the arrest of more than 200 JI members for a variety of reasons. They weren't planning violent attacks, but they were sending people to Syria for training. And one question is whether vengeance would be a possible motivation for a new splinter of JI to emerge, in which case I think there might be a possibility that they could reach out to Al Qaeda in some ways, but we'll come back to that later. Next. Another issue is how local drivers can coincide with new phases of the global jihad. And I mentioned Marawi, but clearly in February 1998, we had the Al Qaeda declaration of the World Islamic Front that urged war on the Christian Zionist International Alliance. And that coincided with turmoil in Indonesia, eventually the overthrow of Suharto, the return of JI leaders from exile in Malaysia to Indonesia, and the outbreak of Christian-Muslim fighting in Ambon. And so for the first time, Indonesians could take this global jihad declaration from Al Qaeda and look at Muslims being killed in Ambon and say, yes, this makes sense. So it's interesting to think that from the time that Southeast Asians started getting trained in Afghanistan in 1985, up through 1999, when that conflict broke out in Ambon, people from that training in Afghanistan never used violence, at least in Indonesia. I have to go back and look at some of the people trained in Afghanistan from the Philippines. Clearly some members of the MILF did for their own insurgency, but it wasn't terrorist violence in the same way. But it was the combination of those factors that produced the violent bombing campaign. Next. And then let me just reiterate this importance of the neglect and injustice narrative. In a way that is going to be a driver of terrorism in Muslim Mindanao until there is a radical change in economic and social structure, economic, social, and political structure. I think some people hoped that BARM would make the difference there. But I think even if BARM succeeds in its aim, and it's got a real uphill battle to do that, that's not going to address all of the issues that this narrative contains. And I think that there will be fertile ground for recruiting unless some other issues are addressed. I think it's very important that people in the BARM area keep track of the progress of Salafi Islam. Right now, everything is under the control of moderates led by the Mufti in BARM. But I think there remains a concern that funding from the Gulf and funding from Saudi Arabia could lead to a greater implantation of radical, even if nonviolent thought. Also, if you look at who's been most supportive in Indonesia of the Taliban victory, it's actually the nonviolent supporters of an Islamic state who want to see Indonesia apply Islamic law in full. Much more than the violent extremists, these are the people that welcomed the Taliban victory. And it's worth looking at who's supporting the Taliban victory in Mindanao, because I think that could be an important indicator of what comes next. Also, when we look at the ISIS side of the equation, and we look at the people arrested for support of ISIS, there's always a set of books or pamphlets or literature, in addition to that circulated on social media, that outline the basic principles of ISIS thought and ISIS teachings. It's really important that there be sharing between Indonesian and Philippine police on that, so people know what to look for, and to make sure that community leaders in Muslim Mindanao know what to look for in terms of that literature. Next. So let's move to what the current status is of the terrorist groups in Southeast Asia. We've basically got the groups with links historically to Al-Qaeda, the groups with the links to ISIS, and some independents that are linked to neither. That includes some of the Dar al-Islam groups in Indonesia. I'm sure there are some groups in the Philippines as well. Well, I would actually put Salahuddin Hassan probably in that group, because he doesn't answer to anybody from any international organization. I think he's a self-starter, as you might call it. But when we talk about the links to Al-Qaeda, we have to remember Jamaat Islami's experience, and it rebuilt after being decimated by arrests after the Bali bombing, so that by 2019, when its leader was arrested, it had about 6,000 members, which is more than it had at the height of its influence in 2001, before the crackdown began. And it included some 80 members who had been trained in Syria in a variety of militias. So unlike the ISIS people who went to Syria with no intention of ever coming back, they went there because they believed the end of the world was approaching, and they wanted to be there for the final battle, and they took their families and so on. For JI, it operated on the old Afghan model. And the old Afghan model, which Salamat Hashim also used to train his MILF people, it was sending people for short-term 3 to 6 months at a time to learn specific skills that they could then bring back and use as necessary in their home country. And that became what triggered the arrests after the Indonesian police became aware that this kind of training was taking place. Now, we don't know if any of those JI guys who returned from Syria, and some of whom are now under arrest, ever ran into anybody from the Philippines. I don't know if anybody's asked, but it would be one thing, it would be very useful for Philippine police to ask their counterparts in Indonesia, is in all of the investigation of JI members who've been arrested, and as I mentioned, it's over 200 in the last 2 years, was there anyone who encountered Filipinos in Syria in any capacity? Because I think that's still a big question mark as to how many are there. But that model of training was only used by JI, and it was only used in Syria. One question going forward and thinking about Afghanistan is, if either the Taliban or Al-Qaeda were to open the possibility of training camps again on Afghan territory, would there be any interest just in the training aspect? Now, in 2010, That was the last time when we saw JI have direct communication with the Al-Qaeda leadership. And that was at a meeting in Bangkok where Al-Qaeda invited JI to take part in violent actions in Southeast Asia, and JI said no. I don't think there's been any change in that stance of Jamaat Islamiyah as an organization, but they believe that sooner or later they will be successful in establishing an Islamic state in Indonesia. And at that point, they will need an army because they believe they need to be on the lookout for political chaos. And when instability occurs, they can exploit it, and they will need to use force at that stage. What are they training in Syria, or what did they train in? It wasn't bomb making, it was sharpshooting. They were training in sniper skills because they believed that when that moment occurred to exploit political chaos, they would have to engage in targeted assassinations. So I think, it raises all sorts of questions about whether there's any ongoing influence of JI in the Philippines, for example. Does this kind of thinking transfer in any way into Mindanao? All we know is that there were 7 members of JI who were still receiving funds or kind of monthly stipends from JI at the time of the arrest of the leader in 2019. Actually, the last known transfers, I think, were in 2015, but they may have continued. We just don't know about it. But nevertheless, that model of using armed force is something that needs to be in the background of thinking by police in the Philippines. If we go to the pro-ISIS groups, the pro-ISIS groups are also weaker now than they were a few years ago. The drying up of travel to Syria made many people lose their enthusiasm for ISIS, but there still are many people who believe that the oath that they swore to al-Baghdadi or his successor al-Quraishi make them obliged to obey any instruction that comes from the ISIS central leadership. And every single ISIS person arrested in Indonesia in recent memory can recite the instruction from the former spokesman of ISIS, now dead, that if you can't join us in Syria, wage war at home, however and whenever you can. And that has been a motivation for ongoing attacks in Indonesia. It's a question whether that same belief that Filipinos who swore the bayat are obliged to continue to obey the instructions from ISIS Central is also operative here. I think it may be among certain groups that were drawn in by ideology, not so much the people who were drawn in for material incentives. We've also seen a perceptible decline in support for ISIS among some Indonesian prisoners, reflecting some good work by police inside prisons. I don't know how the support for ISIS in Sika, for example, and some of the other big prisons in the Philippines has proceeded. There's been a lot of progress in the management of maximum security Philippine prisons, and I think people should feel very good about that progress. But there's still problematic local prisons where people are detained, where they can communicate with their friends on the outside and so on. I think the phenomenon that occurred in Sika right after the declaration of the caliphate in June 2014, when there was a bayat, or an oath of allegiance, sworn inside the prison with an Amir who was chosen as the head of ISIS for the prison. I don't think that could happen in the same way now. I hope that's the case, and maybe we can have a discussion about it. Also, if we go back to looking at the ISIS support in Indonesia, we no longer, in fact, never did have a single structure. But even when you hear the term JAD, Jamaat Ansharut Daulah, it doesn't refer to a single structure any longer. It's just a mess of autonomous cells who are supportive of ISIS, but are not under the direction of an overall chain of command or a hierarchical structure in any way. In the Philippines, I think you have to look at the coalition that swore allegiance to ISIS under Isnilon Hapilon in 2016. And I think there's also been a weakening of that coalition. But despite the weakening, the biggest threat of violence still comes in this region from pro-ISIS groups. Next. This just gives a list of the pro-ISIS groups on the left at the time of Marawi, basically, and the ISIS coalition now, where we don't have a lot of activity in Basilan. You guys can correct me if you, we have ISIS Renau still recruiting, and the slow pace of the Marawi reconstruction hasn't helped there. The Sawajaan group, which was IS Holo or IS Sulu, is seriously weakened by AFP operations and the death in quick succession of many members, top members of the Sawajaan clan, but that's not going to disappear. I think one of the things we've realized about Abu Sayyaf is you can't kill them off. There will there as well. BIF, I think we have two factions at least still active, and reports of Indonesians present there, as well as at least one Indonesian present in IS Renau. And as I mentioned, Salahuddin Hassan is still active, and we periodically hear of one or two foreign fighters with him. I don't know if that's true. Next. So, I think we have to be alert to how local drivers could prompt interest in new international alliance, and the biggest important thing to focus on in Mindanao is BARM. And I think we have to look at what happens with the success or failure of elections and normalization and so on, because this could lead some disgruntled members to look for a more militant option. I think the anti-colonial narrative of the Taliban now could be attractive for some people who also have that kind of narrative in Mindanao, but I think the Taliban's treatment of women is a big turnoff for most Philippine women, including Muslim women in Mindanao. Unlike ISIS, which has encouraged women suicide bombers, not that we should see this as proof of empowerment. But I think in many cases, the ISIS loyalty in Mindanao is likely to hold. It's just important to remember that individual foreign fighters can play a huge role, as Dr. Mahmoud did. So keeping an eye on any of the FTF in the Philippines is important. And as I say, nobody really knows what the situation of FTF overseas is like. Nobody's been able to put a really good figure on the Filipinos in Syria, even with a census undertaken by the US. And we don't know about Filipinos present with AQAP, maybe in the Gulf or indeed in Afghanistan. Next. Possible future scenarios. I think that many people in the region could be inspired by the Taliban victory as a victory over the West without being interested in allying with Al-Qaeda. So I think don't conflate the two, even though there's a linkage. I think, as I mentioned, that the interest in Al-Qaeda would increase if they were to set up a training program. But I don't think the 1990s kind of training with funding and services available for anybody who wanted to get that training will be replicated, partly because I think it's in the Taliban's interest to keep Al-Qaeda under control, since one of the things it badly wants is recognition from the international community. I think that some people have expressed concern that the old generation of Afghan trained Southeast Asians could possibly be inspired to get active again. I don't really think that's likely. And even if there were an amnesty of political prisoners from the MILF as a result of some of the negotiations going on now, and some of the Afghan trained people got released, I don't think that's going to make a major difference in terms of the risk threat. Next. Thing we have to worry about is ISIS Khorasan, but I think even there it's important not to over sensationalize it. Until the August 26th attack, we hadn't heard too much about ISIS Khorasan, except that it had reached a peak of about 2,000 members and then had been pushed back seriously by the Taliban. And like East Asia Wilaya, Khorasan was considered a province of Islamic State and was seen as the jumping off point for expanding Islamic State into Central Asia and South Asia, not so much Southeast Asia. And it was very much seen as the enemy of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So it's weaker than it was a year ago, but the chaos in Afghanistan could be an incentive to ISIS to try and develop Khorasan and expand it, with such high-profile attacks being the means to attract more recruits. Now, we have a Southeast Asia connection that's also linked to the Holo bombings, with an Indonesian from West Sumatra named Saifullah, who left Indonesia via Bangkok for Afghanistan in August 2017, and was sending money to the Andi Baso's cell in Sabah, and was trying to arrange for sending money directly to the Philippines. At the time, his major liaison, a guy named Yoga Febrianto, was captured. But there is a question mark about whether he's still alive or not. We believe he's probably dead, but there's no proof of this. And even if he's dead, there are other Indonesians who are there. All in all, about 24 got to Afghanistan, of whom 8 got arrested. The Taliban has just recently let them all out, but they were families. So there were only 2 adult males in the group. 1 has been accounted for and 1 has not. In addition, you may have seen that 2 supposed Malaysians were caught by the Taliban after the airport attack, but they could be Indonesians claiming to be Malaysians. They could be Filipinos claiming to be Malaysians, but unlikely. I think we need to understand a lot more about what the Southeast Asian presence in ISIS Khorasan is like. Next. This was the map that was developed by the Indonesian police that shows the Holo bombers, Ruli and Ulfa, in the top left-hand corner, Andi Baso under them, and then in the middle with the blue circle, you have Saifullah, this man who was in Afghanistan, and he was collecting money for Mindanao even before he left for Afghanistan. I don't think he's a mastermind, though. He seems to be a rather low-level functionary who was, however, in touch with ISIS, some of the more important Indonesian ISIS leaders in Syria. I think I've covered that. Next. So if ISIS Khorasan is able to expand, it could prove dangerous as a source of funding. It could lead to exploratory visits from ISIS figures who wanted to think about expanding its reach. It could lead to an increase in propaganda and media linkages to Southeast Asia. But as I mentioned, the Taliban has absolutely no interest in seeing ISIS expand and every interest in seeing it crushed. It doesn't want any more airport attacks as we saw in Kabul. Next. So the bottom line is that in the short term, the terrorism risk in this region is probably not much changed by the Taliban victory. The bigger threat is still from ISIS groups, but much will depend on what kind of control the Taliban decides to exert over al-Qaeda and whether al-Qaeda can reestablish training camps that could be, again, a draw for foreign fighters. Thank you.
Wow, that's the word that I can really think of coming from that very exhaustive, detailed, clear presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Sidney Jones. Everybody, please a round of virtual applause for Dr. Sidney. We will go back to some of the things that she highlighted in our open forum. So please hold on to your questions for now or key them into the chat. We will go through them one by one. Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Now, before we continue to our next speaker, allow me first to acknowledge the presence of some very distinguished gentlemen who joined our meeting, starting off with, let me just go to my list here. We have with us Ambassador Marciano Jun Painor. Welcome, sir. Police Major General Bart Bustamante of the Philippine National Police, and our distinguished Chief of the PNP, General Art Lumaba. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. Okay, so before we go to our next speaker, allow me to remind everybody that this webinar is brought to you by the Group Advisory Council of the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group of the PNP, the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, the Institute for Policy Action for IPAC, Ace and Associates, Security Matters, Resilient.ph, Arslan SRS, ASIS International, and the Network for the Prevention of Violent Extremism in the Philippines. Okay, so let's move forward with our next speaker, who has been a constant friend and prime mover of our efforts to really understand and manage the risk of terrorism in the Philippines. He is a political scientist, a security analyst, an international studies expert, a celebrity professor, and a well-known Filipino public intellectual because of his scholarly works on international terrorism, specifically on the Abu Sayyaf group, South China disputes, and geopolitical issues. He is the chairman of the Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research, and president for the Philippine Society for Intelligence and Security Studies, both academic and non-governmental organizations. He has been in academia for almost 30 years and currently a professor lecturer at the International Studies Department of Miriam College. He finished his BA and MA in political science at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, where he also worked on his PhD in political science. He earned his PhD in international relations at the Jinan University in Guangzhou, China. He served as a professor of political science and international relations at the National Defense College of the Philippines, where he was also designated as vice president from 1998 to 2001. Prior to his academic stint at the NDCP, he received appointment as Assistant Professor of International Studies at De La Salle University from 1997 to 1998, University Research Associate at the UP in Diliman, and Instructor in Political Science of the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. Now, because of his deep involvements in peace education, terrorism research, and nonviolent studies, he received the Albani Peace Prize Award for Peace Education. And he also received the Kahanga-Hanga Filipino, or Outstanding Filipino Award in 2012 for Peace Research and National Security Education. I leave it up to you guys to go check up his profile on Wikipedia or on LinkedIn. But for now, please welcome a distinguished scholar and friend of ACE and Associates and Resilient.ph, Dr. Rommel Banlaoi.
Thank you very much, Wally, for that introduction, although I'm a little bit embarrassed because of a very long introduction, but thank you very much for that. And listening to Sidney earlier, I don't know where to begin and how to begin. Maybe we'll just proceed to the open forum, but I prepared something, so maybe I'll discuss this thing for the next 15 minutes just to give you an overview of what transpired in the Philippines 20 years after 9/11. So I'll describe the terrorist threats in the Philippines and the Afghanistan connection, lessons learned 20 years after 9/11, with description of pre-9/11 terrorist activities in the Philippines, and then the 9/11 terrorist attacks, what's the Afghanistan connection, and the post-9/11 terrorist attacks in the Philippines, and briefly lessons learned 20 years after 9/11. So I want to be brief because I want to provide more rooms for open forum later on. So when we talk about Afghan conflict and the pre-terroristic activities, I identified 20 important landmarks events. So let's discuss this very quickly. Of course, we know the Soviet war in Afghanistan. More than 1,000 Filipino Muslim fighters went there to fight. And then in 1987, we saw the arrival of Muhammad Jamal Khalifa to the Philippines to help organize the Abu Sayyaf group. And we saw the rise of Abdurrazzaq Janjalani, who went to Pakistan in order to work with the Taliban. And then when he went back to the Philippines, he organized the Abu Sayyaf group. He originally called the Al-Harakatul Al-Islamiyah, or the Islamic Movement. And the first terrorist attacks that he did was the 1991 Embedulus bombing, okay? And then the Davao Cathedral bombing of December 1993, then the Zamboanga City bombing of June 1994. And then during this period, we saw the arrival of Ramsey Youssef to the Philippines in order to plan the Bujinka plot and also to assassinate Pope John Paul II in January 1995 during the youth summit. And then we also saw the arrival of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in July 1994. And of course, they experimented on the liquid bomb, the glyconium device, by bombing Philippine Airlines Flight 434, killing one Japanese passenger. And also another test bomb at Cebu City Mall bombing and Greenbelt Theater bombing, testing all the improvised explosive devices developed by Ramsey Youssef until we discovered Bujinka plot in January 1995. So, but I would like to tell everybody that when I was researching as a scholar, I encountered this very important document released in December 1994. And at this time, during this time, Ramsey Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed were already operating in the Philippines. The title of the secret report is Islamic Fundamentalist Movements in the Philippines and Their Links with International Terrorist Organizations, prepared by a team headed by General Garcia, and then late General Bugi Mendoza, and then very young police officer, now Police Major General Ferro. And every time I read this document, the Islamic Fundamentalist Movement in the Philippines and Their Links with International Terrorist Organizations, I feel like I'm reading current events. And I don't know if General Pero already still have a copy of this document, but I kept my own copy, a personal copy of General Mendoza, because before General Mendoza died, he transferred to me a lot of documents that until now I consider to be valuable in understanding the problems of terrorism in the Philippines prior to 1991. And this document indicated already that the Abu Sayyaf group had direct link with Al-Qaeda and even Jamaya Islamiyah. Of course, we learned that Bujinka Plat was discovered in January 1995. And I would like to pay attention to the role of General Art Lumibo at that time, because he was the chief of the Public Information Office of the Philippine National Police at that time, and being headed by the DILG at that time was Alunan and President Ramos. So all these figures investigated the Bujinka Plat, especially the interrogation of Habib Murad. Okay, the one of the proposed hijackers of the airline bombs. So I will not discuss that in detail, but I would like to emphasize the following pre-911 terrorist activities in the Philippines. And for me, the most significant was the April raid of 1995, because that was the attempt of Abu Sayyaf group to really mount military action in southern Philippines. And as a result of that, there was massive manhunt against him, leading to his death in 1998. But his death, we saw the rise of Gaddafi Janjalani, who conducted a lot of kidnap for ransom activities, especially, the Tamuhubong kidnappings of 50 students, where a lot of Muslim detainees accused of various crimes associated with terrorism are currently in Sika. Most of them are charged of Tamuhubong kidnappings. Then we saw the kidnapping of Susan Enriquez, and of course, the very well-known Sipatan kidnappings. Then Tulok kidnapping of 10 foreign journalists. Then, of course, the kidnapping of Anak Kapagal, my very good friend. And then Jeff Chiri kidnapping. And, of course, the most shocking attack that happened during this period was the Rizal Day bombing of December 2000. And followed by the Dos Palmas kidnapping of May 2001 until we saw the 9/11 terrorist attacks that year. So that's the April raid. I'd like to pay attention to the role of Edwin Anguiles or Ibrahim Yaqub, because General Mendoza and General Ferro interrogated the Edwin Anguiles and also Gaddafi Janjalani, along with another ASG member, Juvenal Bruno. So I kept all the interrogation reports of these people, and they will give you a lot of very insightful information about Al-Qaeda activities in the Philippines prior to 9/11. So that's these are just the incidents that I mentioned earlier. Then this is the Rizal Day bombing, okay, and perpetrated by Al-Ghusi, but masterminded by Ridwan Isamuddin or Hambali, okay, with to indicate that Abu Sayyaf group at that time, especially the more militant faction of the more Islamic Liberation Front, had ties with Jamaya Islamiyah, with the intention to create the Uli Islamiyah Nasuntara or the Islamic Caliphate in Southeast Asia. And we know that during this time, there was a Mantiki structure of Jamaya Islamiyah, and the Philippines belonged to Mantiki III. And the Philippines during this time played a vital role in training, okay, of jihadists, not only in the southern Philippines, but also in the wider Southeast Asian region. So these are the kidnapping until 9/11 happened. Okay, and 9/11 happened, the Bujinka Plot, okay, as stated earlier by General Ferro, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed pursued the plan to hijack airliners. So this is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the Bujinka Plot. Okay, that happened. So what happened after 9/11? After 9/11, there was a global war on terror. Okay, but at that time, I also wrote a book, War on Terrorism in Southeast Asia, to emphasize that the Philippines became the second front in the global war on terrorism launched by the United States because of the strong connections of Abu Sayyaf group with the international terrorist organization, especially at that time during the leadership of Rodelon Sahiron and then leadership of Gaddafi Janjalani. And during this period is Nilon Hapilon, who will play a vital role in the Maravis. He was just a sub-leader of Abu Sayyaf group at that time, but he rose from the ranks. And of course, the most devastating attack that occurred during the period after 9/11 was the Super Ferry 14 bombing that killed 116 people. Okay, and this was the rise of maritime terrorism in the Philippines. Originally, suicide terrorism, and I had the pleasure of interviewing suspects to this terrorist attack, especially Redento in Dalosa, who has been convicted and now in Muntinlupa jail, and of course Ahmad Santos. Okay, Ahmad Santos. I think during this time, General Lumibao was already being eyed to become the chief of the Philippine National Police. Okay, and of course the Valentine's Day bombing happened. Okay, it's a simultaneous bombing in Makati City, General Santos City, and Davao City. And we also saw the Bikutan siege of March 16, 2005. I cannot forget this day because this was the birthday of my wife. And at that time also, General Arturo Limuba was the chief of the PNP during this siege that led to the neutralization of key terrorist personalities associated with the Abu Sayyaf group, like Commander Global, Commander Kosovo, and Commander Robot. With that. And then the death of Gaddafi Janjalari in 2006 as a result of Uplan ultimatum, but his death will show the rise of Isnilon Hapilon. Okay? And will show the rise of Yasser Igasan and Puruji Indama and Kair Mundos. Okay? And Radulan Sahiron will still be there, but the one people orchestrating a lot of terrorist activities will emanate from the followers of Isnilon Hapilon. And as a result of that, we passed the Human Security Act of 2007. And as a footnote to Human Security Act of 2007, when this was, before it was passed, General Arturo Limibo was the chief of the National Counterterrorism Action Group, which became the forerunner of the Anti-Terrorism Council, which until now is still existing, and had the pleasure of working with General Lumibo at that time. And thanks to then Colonel Ferro for introducing me to General Lumibo at that time. So and my exposure with them led me to write these two major books, Counterterrorism Measures in Southeast Asia and Philippine Security in the Age of Terror. And then 2010, Osama bin Laden was killed, and also other terrorist personalities. Okay? However, we saw the evolution of terrorist threats in the Philippines, and we saw that evolution with the bombing of bus in Buendia, Makati areas in January 25, 2011, because there was a person in the name of Luis Mercado Prudente, okay, who will later on be associated with what now we call as the Black Flag Movement. Black Flag Movement initially advocated by Abu Dar and then by Reza Kiram and other foreign terrorist personalities that are coming from Malaysia. And if you will see here, Reza Kiram will soon travel to Syria to fight with ISIS there, and eventually present a video beheading suspected spies of the ISIS. Okay. And during this period after the death of Osama bin Laden, I delivered a lecture in Cebu City in September 2011, indicating that the threat of terrorism in the Philippines is changing a new phase. I don't know yet at that time what kind of phase, but eventually that phase will turn out to be the phase of ISIS. Okay. Okay. So, and ISIS. And then, prior to the rise of ISIS in the Philippines, we saw the Abu Sayyaf group doing a lot of kidnapping activities with the kidnapping of Warren Richard. And why is it that Richard Rodwell kidnapping was very significant in understanding terrorist threats in the Philippines? Because for the first time, the Abu Sayyaf group used social media to propagandize, and also the prominent use of the Black Flag that will later on be associated with ISIS. So, and then 2012 was an important year for me because it became I became very busy during this period because we saw a lot of happenings at that time. The raid of Butig-Lanao del Sur in July 2016, the rural transit bombing. The rural transit bus bombing was initially attributed to rogue faction of the MALF, and then rogue faction of the MNLF, and then was was pinpointed to the Abu Sayyaf group, but later on, we will discover that the rural transit bus bombing will be perpetrated by individuals associated with the Black Flag movement, the forerunner of the Dawliyah Islamiya Wilayatul Mashriq, formed by Isnilon Hapilon. And then we saw the Calabasa, Zamboanga City raid in September 20, then Cagayan de Oro bombing, and Sidney knows this very well, the uploading of propaganda video of November 6, okay? Because this propaganda video was the first video where we can see the use of black flag associated with ISIS. And then we saw the death of Fikri in December 2012, okay, when he detonated himself a bomb in Fikri. So the Botiglanao del Sur, now, the raid of Botiglanao del Sur is very important because Marwan left behind 2 laptop computers. Okay, and I had the pleasure of accessing the hard drives of these 2 laptop computers that until now I am examining to give us a better understanding of the links of local terrorist groups with foreign terrorist organizations, particularly ISIS. And in this laptop computer, where I saw this display of picture Khilafah coming soon to Syria. And this happened in 2012, only to find out that this Khilafah will now be called the Islamic State. Okay. And this was in 2012. This came from the laptop of Marwan, confiscated after the Botig raid. Then we saw a lot of pictures waving the banner of Black Flag. And of course, the arrest of Cairo Mundos also gave us a lot of insights about the Black Flag movement. Okay, and of course, Dulmatin's activities, and this is the YouTube I was telling you about, perpetrated by Pareha. Okay, but this was the first video where we can see the use of Black Flag as is now associated with ISIS. Then we saw the death of Ustad Sanusi, and the death of Ustad Sanusi will give us an understanding of the rise of Maote group or Dawliyah Islamiyah Fira now, and then all these activities. Then we saw the rise of ISIS, and I want to pay attention to the rise of ISIS because Abu Dar was mimicking the picture of Abu Musab al-Sarkawi, okay? And Humam Abdul Najid will be associated with the Maote group. In fact, he replaced the Maote brothers when they died during the Marawi siege. Okay, this is the structure of it. Kermundos arrested. So, and then Isnilon Hapilon pledged allegiance to ISIS. Okay, and then many other pro-ISIS groups in the Philippines pledged their allegiance. And we saw the Suyupol Khilafah Filoson, and until again the arrest of Musa Ser Antonio in May 2016, and then well, the reason why I'm interested on the arrest of Musa Ser Antonio, because his laptop computer also contains a lot of information about the use of Black Flag, and at the same time describing the Philippines as the training center of what is called Katiba Nasuntara Dawliyah Islamiyah. We can find in his laptop computers a lot of evidences of his admiration of ISIS. With this kind, so I'll just and we saw all these events, okay, the beheading perpetrated by the Maote group, okay, and then we saw the election of Duterte in 2016, but his election led to the Davao City bombing in September 2016 and Leyte bombing in December 28, all associated with ISIS activities. So, and before the siege of Marawi in May 2017, we saw this propaganda video indicating that they were preparing for some type of military activities because they were training not for improvised explosive devices, but for combat training. Okay? And this kind of training will lead to the Marawi siege of 2017, but before that, Abu Turaipe from Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighter pledged allegiance to ISIS until we saw the bull clash in April to May 2015, okay, all related with ISIS activities in the Philippines until we saw the Marawi siege, okay, and the rest is history. So, what have we learned 20 years after 9/11 and 4 years after the Marawi liberation? This is what we learned. Rise of suicide terrorism. Why? Because 4 years after Marawi liberation, 20 years after 9/11, we already experienced, the Philippines already experienced 5 major suicide terrorist attacks. And I will not discuss that. So what have we learned? The terrorist threats in the Philippines through the years have become adaptive and resilient to the new situation. Persistent and evolving due to crime-terrorism nexus. Okay? Complex because it's being enmeshed in many other issues. And most importantly, threats run in the family. You know, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the brother-in-law of Osama bin Laden. Ramzi Youssef was the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and we also saw the rise of the Maoti family, okay, and many other families. And in my discussions of the evolution of Abu Sayyaf Group from 1989 to 2021, it can also navigate from Al Qaeda to ISIS now under the new Taliban area. What kind of form we can see from the Abu Sayyaf Group now after the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, that remains to be seen. But we have seen that all these issues are related with a lot of issues perpetuating many acts of violence in the southern Philippines. So now, 20 years after 9/11 and 4 years after Marawi liberation, we still have the following groups still active in the Philippines: the Abu Sayyaf Group, remnants of Maoti Group, now headed by Abu Zakaria Group, then the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, factionalized into 3, Toraipe, Carayalan, and Bungos, remnants of Ansar Khalifa Philippines, being headed by the Dilong Group. Now we have a new shadowy group, Hassan Salahuddin Group, then followers of Suyot Kilapa Piloson, and also foreign terrorist fighters. And because of that, the Global Terrorism Index of 2020 described the Philippines to be the epicenter of ISIS terror threat in Southeast Asia, and the Philippines continues to be in the top 10 of countries in the world most impacted by terrorism. So future prospects, persistent emerging threats. These are the future prospects. Aviation terrorism, because they used the drone during the Marawi siege. Of course, maritime terrorism, car bombs, the usual, but I pay more attention to the rise of lone wolf suicide terrorism. These are personalities not associated with the known groups that we have, but can mount suicide terrorist attacks because of radicalization through the use of social media and also the use of animal bombs. So those are the things that we need to prevent in the future. And most importantly, the rise of what I call juvenile suicide terrorism. Okay, the involvement of many young people in violent activities in the southern Philippines. So I will skip that. I just want to emphasize that we have passed the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020 and implementing the National Action Plan to counter and prevent violent extremism. Now, while we have this stronger legal measure against terrorism, there's still a great need, however, to strengthen community-based approach and private sector participation to counter the threat of terrorism in the Philippines, particularly persistent and emerging terrorist threats. I'm so very glad that Asian Associate, ASIS International, Resilient PH, and other private security professionals are here to really engage with our government sector to have what I call public-private sector partnership in countering terrorism in the Philippines, so that we can have a real whole-of-nation approach against terrorism. So we have this is the framework being developed by the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and as a result of that, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, especially during the time of General Sobihana, implemented the BRAVE approach, broad reforms in addressing violent extremism, supporting the PAVE approach initiated by Deputy Speaker Mujib Ataman in Basilan. Okay? And of course, the Network for the Prevention of Violent Extremism in the Philippines, that emphasizes the role of civil society organizations in countering terrorism in the Philippines and emphasizing the need for a community-based approach in countering terrorism in the Philippines. So these are just our efforts to do that. Then again, the success and failure of the Bangsamoro Transition Authority will also drive the direction of terrorist threats in the Philippines. And we just hope that the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, if extended, will perform better than what we did during the last 3 years in order to address the performance deficit. Now, the Taliban connection, well, we know that the Islamic State Khorasan has a very strong relationship with Islamic State East Asia. We don't know how strong the relationship now, but based on their past relationship, the ISIS Khorasan played a vital role in facilitating funding of the Marawi siege of 2017, as well as the Hulo Cathedral bombing of 2018 or 2019, as mentioned earlier by Sidney. So the Marawi siege, okay, these are just the funding of the Marawi siege and Hulo Cathedral bombing to what Sidney mentioned earlier, to the actions of Saifullah, whether he's dead or alive, doesn't matter to me. But what matters is that the link between ISIS Khorasan and ISIS East Asia. Okay. So these are just, and they use the following platforms to transfer money: Telegram and Western Union. Will the return of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, or the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan, affect the Philippines? This is a very interesting thing that I discovered lately. I encountered this website, Islamic Emirate of the Philippines. I don't know if this is connected with the Taliban or connected with ISIS or connected with Al-Qaeda, but this is something that we need to monitor. And I already shared this website to our concerned law enforcement authorities to monitor this. But the last time I accessed it last week, it's already frozen. Okay. But for me, this is an indicator that there is an emerging threat to contend with. So with that note, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now open for discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rommel Banlaoi. Round of virtual applause again, everybody. So we have enough time to accommodate questions, but let me start off with a couple that's been shared with me. I'll start with the question from Sir John Sangalang. His question is addressed to Dr. Sidney, and it has to do with the first mention about the listing. Let me just go back to that question. He said, Sir John Sangalang said, it is mentioned that the MILF joined forces with JI for the bombing of LRT in 2000. Is there a reliable report source to validate this? If so, why was not MILF designated or listed under the U.S. State Department among its terrorist list? And he's shared that the list is updated yearly. So, Dr. Sidney?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that there was some disagreement at the time the Special Forces unit was set up. And just as there was disagreement within JI about whether it was appropriate to undertake Al-Qaeda style actions. But I think that the role of the special forces has been documented, especially especially with the role of Mukosid Delna, who's one of the Afghan trained political detainees now that is being considered for amnesty, I think, among the MILF. But he and was it Mukhlis Yunus, who was another one of the members of the special force unit that was involved in that. So it wasn't anybody associated with Murad who was involved in that action.
Thank you, Dr. Sidney. Sir John, if you have follow-up questions, please put them in. I see Major General raising his hand. Yes, sir.
Actually, Dr. Sidney, during the time that Al-Ghuzi was arrested, I have the chance to debrief him. And during the debriefing with Sir Boogie Mendoza, he narrated that the December 30 bombing was a test run by the group of KSM, of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for a higher objective. And it was the seizure of a large cache of explosives in General Santos City and firearms in a mosque that lead us to believe that the December 30 bombing, which I coded Fidel. There were 5 bombings in one single day. Plaza Ferguson for F. I is for the international airport. D is for Duset Hotel. E is for Edson Bus, and L is for LRT. So those were the explosives that were allegedly used were are are of dynamite type. So we believe that the said attack on December 30 was perpetrated by the group of Al Qaeda, and the group of Moklis Yunus and the other SOG, they were just used as the one was logistics, the others were used as the conduit or the other. So that were the information that we shared earlier on during that time when Al-Ghuzi was arrested, and eventually he escaped, and then he was again trapped in central Mindanao and was eventually neutralized by the armed services. That's for the information of the body.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Yeah, Sir John, you're still raising your hand.
Yes, sir. I would like to, based from what I've asked, so what then is the designation of the MILF that time? Were they supposed to be part or designated as terrorists or not? And if so, why they were not included on the State Department lists?
They were never included because I think the United States was supportive of the efforts to try and draw them into negotiations at that stage. And as I mentioned, it wasn't the MILF as a whole that was involved in that action.
Okay.
Thank you. And this is a follow-up question from George Dominguez. Is the threat relative to the LRT bombing still active?
No, because I think the Special Operations Unit no longer exists. And also JI isn't interested in bombing any longer. So that kind of alliance doesn't exist. I would be very surprised if those two parties engaged in any kind of joint action again.
Thank you. This is an interesting question from Mr. Leo Ferrer. What is the possibility that rogue politicians employ the services of the IS empire terror groups for the 2022 elections?
I answered that directly to him, but I think the Philippines is a place where there are a lot of corrupt politicians and there's a lot of corruption in the extremist groups as well. So it's perfectly possible that if a group is running low on funds and there's the prospect of getting funds from a corrupt politician to work in his employ for a limited period or her employ, it's not impossible that that alliance could be made.
Okay. Thank you. This one is from Sir Hermie Colina. From a geopolitical perspective, is there a possibility that China could exert significant influence in the Taliban, given the latter's preference to participate in China's BRI? How about the terms of agreement between the US and the Taliban that led to the withdrawal in Afghanistan? The agreement has not largely been discussed, but he believes there is some insurance in there.
Well, I think there was supposed to be some insurance about the nature of an inclusive government, I think, and the government that we've seen announced from the Taliban is anything but inclusive. They've gone back to the most hardline members of the organization. In terms of China's role, I think China wants to do a piece of political one-upsmanship vis-a-vis the United States. And and both China and Russia are interested in establishing good relations with the Taliban. China, though, is also very worried about the Uyghur groups, which in the past have had support from Al-Qaeda, and in the past were supported by the Taliban. Now, whether or not the Taliban can manage that relationship is a big question, because just imagine they're standing in the Muslim world if they make their first major international diplomatic move to establish good relations with China. That's not going to go over that well.
Okay. Then we have here from Mary Valdez. On the grassroots level, what's an effective way to neutralize or prevent terrorist threats without implying or suggesting social, perceptual errors or discrimination among suspicious people? On the topic of social justice being a factor, a sensitive interaction may implicate the idea of conflict instead of security. And on behalf of the industrial security sector, what would be the recommendations in handling situations like this?
It's a real tough question because you don't want to be seen as profiling anybody, and I think anything that smacks of profiling, for example, a woman wearing a headscarf, if she encountered any discrimination, that would be disastrous in terms of the, on every possible score. So I think one of the things to do is just make sure as a company that you know who the imam is for the mosque that's attended by most of your employees, for example. Know who the imam is, know the background, just see if there are flyers distributed, and often there are informational flyers that are completely, fine and religious in nature. But I think be aware of your surroundings, but don't take it out on in terms of discrimination against your employees. And if necessary, encourage a kind of discussion group with your human resources department that would allow any instance of somebody feeling profiled to be heard.
Okay, got it. I'll address this question first to Dr. Banlaoi. You mentioned, this one was shared to me privately. You mentioned about the need to strengthen public-private partnership and the role of the private sector in all of these efforts to counter extremism. So can you spell out some of the concrete ways by which the private sector can actually participate?
Well, the private sector should open dialogue with government agencies about their counterterrorism plans, because the private sector also needs information coming from the government, and also the government also needs sharing of information coming from the private sector. So I think the collaboration will start from intelligence sharing or information sharing between the two entities, because for me, sharing of information is essential for prevention, or if not prevention, it's also essential for response when an attack takes place. So just open channels of communication between the two, and after that, maybe work on something. Maybe the government can help the private sector design their counterterrorism plan, and also the private sector can share its exemplary practices to the Philippine government on how to do it. And I know some of the private sectors having a very impressive counterterrorism prevention plan.
Thank you for that. Okay, next one from Miss Neri Capiral. Do you think the good relationship between the Philippines and Israel has connection to some terrorism in some parts of the country? Anybody can just come in and chime in.
I don't think so. I don't think there's any direct link between relations with Israel and terrorist attacks.
Okay, then this one is somehow, I think, answered partly earlier. Do you see or foresee any future collaboration or alliances of ISIS, the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda group?
I think what you have to look for, I don't think at a central leadership level, there's any prospect of reconciliation. But you always have to look for defections from a group, because IS Khorasan, for example, was formed by people defecting from some of the Pakistan and Afghan Taliban. So it's possible for disgruntled members to cross over into the other organization. And also it frequently takes place that at a very local level, where you don't have deep ideological convictions, that it would be possible for groups to reconcile on the ground in a place like the Philippines, where even when the leadership was still completely mutually hostile.
Got it. Okay, so it's 12 noon exactly, and I have been told that we are extending our Q&A for 2 days. Just kidding. For a couple of minutes, because there are still so many interesting questions that's coming up. So guys, keep on sending your questions, and I will read out loud the questions so that our speakers and other people can hear them out and have our speakers share their insights on them. Let me go to this one that I think is a very interesting question from Sir Hermie again, addressed to Dr. Banlaoi. Have we actually learned our lessons from the time of the black shirts, Liaga groups, to the BIFF, ASG, etc.?
Yeah, we have learned our lessons. In fact, right now, 20 years after 9/11, we have a better understanding of terrorist threats. Unlike before, we were blind about the nature of terrorist threats. Now we have a better understanding of terrorist threats. Second, after 9/11, our law enforcement authorities, the PNP and AFP, have undergone a lot of capacity building programs. So they know now how to respond. In fact, if you will make an inventory of government efforts, there were a lot of preventions that took place. Preventions and arrests. And right now we see a lot of returning ASG members and BIFF members because of these intensified efforts of the Philippine government. So we have learned a lot, but we have to remain vigilant, because threats are also evolving. They are all adaptive. They're also resilient. They are just waiting for the right opportunity to strike again. So let us deprive them the opportunity to strike again. And that's why I am emphasizing 3 important measures to prevent another attacks to happen in the Philippines. One is information sharing and intelligence, strengthening intelligence gathering. Second is countering the financing of terrorism. And third, because of the possible spillover of Afghanistan conflict to the southern Philippines, strengthening our border control. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Banlaoi. Interesting, because you call the threats resilient. And it's also very mindful for us to understand that indeed, these threats, while some of them, as mentioned by Dr. Sidney, have waned down over the years, we cannot let our guards down. And I think from the sharing of Major General Ferro earlier and the efforts that the PNP and the task force have been doing, we can see that the movement is there to constantly take up the challenge of being vigilant. This one is from Ms. Amargo. Thank you, Dr. Sidney, for mentioning your observations on downplaying the ideology of violent extremist groups in Mindanao and holding more to the belief of material incentives in joining pro-IS affiliates. Do you see the prospect of more of the propagation of Al-Qaeda ideology instead of IS in Muslim Mindanao, with your assessment of the disinterest of the Taliban in associating with the IS?
Hi, Grace. Nice to hear from you.
I will marry you.
I think that we could see more of an effort to revive the global Islamic media front, which was the Al-Qaeda arm that was very active at one stage in Southeast Asia, but I don't think it will be in a position to compete with ISIS, because ISIS is just too well established and too decentralized to have a real competitor now.
Thank you. This one is from Mr. Ligayo, citing the BARM as significant factor in Mindanao development and with inclusion of the Philippine national elections next year. What attributes of leadership should showcase its political leaders that can lead to the autonomous region that could influence the threat against terrorism? Let me try to go back to that question. What would be the attributes of leadership that must be showcased by our political leaders that can lead the region in influencing the probably action against terrorism?
I think the best thing to do is for the leadership to showcase what it's doing with the Islamic schools and the rehabilitation of mosques to reassure the community that there is no hardline stance being purveyed by the BARM, and indeed there's not. I mean, you've got very good moderate leadership within the BARM on this, but I think it probably needs to be publicized more, particularly on the Islamic school side.
Okay. I'm seeing Major General Ferro. Yes, sir.
On the question on how we could really encourage our Muslim brothers to have faith on the BARM is, first, I think good governance is the key for these Muslim brothers to believe that the solution to peace is the creation of BARM. Second, I would believe on the grassroots approach is a more responsive educational system should be in place so that our young, especially the youth, the young Muslim brothers and sisters, will be able to be educated, especially that should be co-equal with our efforts on de-radicalization, so that moderate Islam should be part of our initiative on our leaders in BARM to be part of their advocacy, because moderation in Islam will be the key to de-radicalizing our brothers who have been interpreting their ideology, their religion into a more dangerous path. So that's my take, Madam answers.
Thank you, sir. Again, from Hermie, from the international information sharing, do you think the US had already addressed the issue, given that this is one of the major findings of the 9/11 Commission, the CIA and the FBI? International information, sir. Yeah, sir, Major General.
Actually, I have heard a lot of that particular question because I myself was one responsible for handing the documents for our counterpart with the US about the 9/11 blueprint. I think the issue on divisiveness among law enforcement and other intelligence unit have been resolved through the years, and with the collaboration and inking of several information sharing protocols, like for the World Bomb Data Centers Association, we have inked that in Frankfurt, Germany, some 10 years ago or 13 years ago. So I think the sharing is extensively being practiced here in the Philippines. The armed forces intelligence and the police intelligence and other intelligence entities are really working it so that we could apply the whole of government, the whole of nation approach on all terrorist threats in our country.
Okay, thank you, Major General. This one is from LT Dog De Feles. Is international terrorist funding still prevalent in the Philippines? Any of our speakers?
I don't think it's prevalent, but I think there's probably some international funding coming through. I think it's clear that funding from ISIS Central, which used to be coming in from Syria, has pretty much dried up. I think that one of the moves that was made by the finance guys in Syria, however, was to transfer resources to Khorasan, so that some of the funding, although most of the funding from Marawi wasn't sent through Khorasan, it was sent from Syria through Southeast Asia. I think that there was some funds transferred to Khorasan, but we don't know what's happened to that now either.
Okay. This one is addressed to you both, Doc Banlaoi and Doc Jones. Is there a possibility of U.S. troops redeployment to Afghanistan to somehow neutralize the security situation there at? If so, what could be the main driving force for such an act?
I don't think President Biden is likely to
Yeah.
support sending troops back to Afghanistan anytime soon.
Right. Okay. Given a lot of the press that's been said about all the efforts to move out, I think I tend to agree with Dr. Jones on this. This one for Dr. Banlaoi. Down in the tactical level, armed groups change affiliations like changing clothes. Ideology is not of prime importance, but on the funding the groups that they can receive, what would be the COAs to address this course of actions to address this problem?
Well, that's the resilience and adaptability of the threat groups in the Philippines. They follow the color of the flags depending on the color of the money. So Al-Qaeda used to fund them, so they pledge allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And then when the funding was coming from ISIS, then they pledge allegiance to ISIS. And I see that ISIS is still trying to throw its weight around in the Philippines by funding the activities of Kermin Bantas. ISIS Central funded the media propaganda videos of Kermin Bantas released after the Ramadan. And also, in what happened last month in Munay, Lanao del Sur, there was a fighting there with the group of Kermian Bantas, the remnants of Mauti group, and the Islamic State media acknowledged that there were fighters of the Islamic State that encountered the Philippine government forces in Munay, Lanao del Sur, indicating that somehow the Islamic State can still deliver their funding. Because of my observation, the threat groups in the Philippines cannot mount any serious acts of terrorism without funding coming from external source. And if they have internal source, they will just use that for maintaining their followers. But major terrorist attacks are in fact funded by external sources, initially by Al-Qaeda, then eventually by ISIS.
Can I just say that one of the things to remember, though, is that terrorist attacks don't cost a lot of money, especially in this region.
Okay, fantastic to know and terrifying to know that. So they don't have allegiance to the flag necessarily. They have allegiance to the color of the money. Okay, that can help them come up with attacks. But as Doc Jones mentioned, they don't really cost a lot of money. I was told to go straight to the question of Chief Art Lumibao. Then this is question to Dr. Banlaoi and General Bert Ferro. Do you see any need to create a national task force similar to the National Task Force to end local communist insurgency, but focused on extremism to detect, prevent, and respond to the emerging threat as a result of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban? Something similar to the NACTAG.
General Ferro, you first. Oh, where's General Ferro? While waiting for him, so thank you very much, sir, for that question. But in my opinion, we already have the Anti-Terrorism Council, and the Anti-Terrorism Council has strengthened its organization to act like the task force. And in the Anti-Terrorism Law of 2020, there were additional powers given to Anti-Terrorism Council. So if they will only perform their task, I think there's no need to create another task force. But if the Anti-Terrorism Council will fail to do its tasks mandated by existing law, then a task force is needed to do that. But right now, I think the Anti-Terrorism Council can handle it. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Banlaoi. Major General Ferro, I cannot track him in my monitor. Okay. So this one is an interesting point, and I would just like to ask this very quickly. Dr. Banlaoi, Dr. Jones, aren't both of you blacklisted by the terrorist groups?
Sidney.
I would assume that they are closely being monitored, but this because you are experts and the insights that you're sharing are really spot on. And we have a lot more questions in the chat. We will take note of them and try to see if our speakers can get back to them. But I would like to take and abuse my authority as MC to ask a stupid question from my perspective. Guys, Dr. Jones, Dr. Banlaoi, do you think the global developments relative to one, the pandemic and the response, and in terms of the inequality of vaccines, as well as the impact of climate change to vulnerable communities, do you think this global crisis phenomenon are also triggering or empowering our extremist groups to really leverage on them to exploit the vulnerabilities of people to get to them to support their causes?
I think it varies from one area to another. There was one group in Indonesia, in Central Sulawesi, that saw COVID as an ally because it saw it as weakening the West and therefore giving new opportunities to attack. But it's also reduced the possibility of fundraising for many extremist groups that depended on member contributions. And as the economy turns down, those contributions also dry up. And it's imposed travel restrictions, not just for police forces that can't get from one area to another, but also for extremists themselves. It's just more difficult. One of the things it's also done is pushed more extremists to hold meetings online rather than direct face-to-face meetings. And that means that it's even more important to have a good cyber patrol within your CT police force.
Thank you. Okay, I'm being told to wrap up, but I would just like to ask this to you guys, to Dr. Jones and to Dr. Banlaoi first, because we have members of the media covering the event. I would like to ask you guys, what would be your message to the media covering this in terms of our fight against extremism in the Philippines and globally, that they can share when they develop the story about this webinar?
I think I would say, please stress how much progress there's been in 20 years. And there really have been major achievements. So yes, the Taliban victory is a huge setback, but it doesn't mean that overnight you're going to lose all those gains.
I agree with Sidney. I agree very absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. And while we want to do a lot more question and answer, we have exceeded our time. So at this point, I'd like to call the Chief Executive Officer of ACE and Associates and one of the organizers of this webinar, Sir Ace Esmeraldo, to do the closing remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm so thankful for all our speakers, especially Dr. Sidney Jones and Professor Banlaoi, and to my dear Mr. Major General Albert Ferro, and also to the Advisory Council led by Mr. Torres. I'd like to encourage everyone, especially those attending here now who are in the uniform or in the active service and in the corporate world, that this event is really significant to me also, because 911 is the pivot point wherein from my corporate life I shifted to corporate security also. That's why people who knows me will always know that I always thank Ben Laden for the shift. No, I don't know if I have to thank him or not, but I just like to have this message that like to emphasize to all our attendees that whether where you are now, you are always affected by terrorism. Um, so it is very important for us that we look at anti-terrorism as an advocacy, especially when we move already to the area of community involvement. As mentioned by Professor Banlaoi, he mentions about local community. Dr. Jones mentioned about global community. Because terrorism doesn't have any borders. If I go back to my life, it is very parallel and divergent also to General Ferro's. No, when we were young lieutenants, and we're still young now, we fight against the NPAs and also in the same time in the Muslim areas of Mindanao. I remember when he was a young PC intel officer and I was with the Task Force Cotabato as the ground commander. We share intel notes, no? And then suddenly I find out that Bert Ferro was able to successfully trace a lot of people, and that has really been a collaboration with the Army and the Philippine Constabulary at the time, and then the PNP. So I would like to say also that for us in the corporate world, our lives will be really be changed because from targets of military installation, it is now the soft targets which are the corporate assets. So for me, when April raid happened, I was with Task Force Cotabato. I responded accordingly, preparing that they will also attack Cotabato City. And also in my corporate life, I realized that I'm still affected by what's happening in Mindanao after 911. During the 911, I was really having my time with the corporate real estate, and I was handling several properties. And then when I saw the planes going through the Twin Towers, things change, no? The perspective changed. So whether you're in the uniform or in the corporate service, this is the time now that we have to collaborate. Because I know that General Ferro is very recognizable, and he really appreciates the involvement of private companies. That's why we have dragged here the Access International and other groups, and even Resilient PH, because in the world of the DRCM, or Disaster Risk and Crisis Management, we consider terrorism already as man-made disaster. So I would like also to go back a little bit to the sharing of Professor or Dr. Banlaoi about the Black Flag. I remember the Cagayan de Oro bombing. We were sharing notes, and Dr. Banlaoi knows that there are really different things that we have to see things that they may be teaching us a different way, especially in the advent of the use of social media. So I'm so thankful also, in closing, that we have General Art Lumibao, the former chief of PNP, and also Ambassador Jun Painor, who is now with the Ayala Group, and he is on board here. And also General Bart Bustamante, may Mista also. Thank you for your questions and inputs in the chat box. And I would like to thank everyone who are present here for joining. I know that medyo bitin, we are short of the time, but that would be a good indicator that we will have part 2 of this. And most likely the part 2 will really translating the lessons learned from the past 20 years on how are we going to protect our stakeholders. And for those who are in the PNP and in the AFP, your stakeholders are the corporate, and at the same time, the corporate are also involved in the collaboration and the intel exchange. No? information exchange with the government entities. So thank you everyone for attending this. Thank you, Wally of Resilient PH, for hosting and emceeing this event. It's very well done, and I'm so thankful also for Dr. Sidney Jones and Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, and to Mr. Torres and all those who attended, and especially to the promoter natin, which is General Ferro. Thank you very much. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Ace. Now for the mandatory, non-mandatory photo op, can we request everybody to please turn on your videos? This is also for documentation purposes. Sidney, I think you're familiar with the Philippine trait of also trying to get as much groupies as possible whenever we have events. That translates to even on virtual meetings like this. So everybody put on a smile. There are several slides that we need to go through. So Ms. Lai, if you're ready. Keep the smiles, ladies and gentlemen. Almost to the last slide, last page. Okay, so again, to Chairman Torres, to Major General Ferro, to Dr. Sidney Jones, to Dr. Rommel Banlaoi, the organizers, and all of you guys who participated in this webinar. Lessons learned 20 years after 9/11 and the Afghanistan connection. We hope you remain safe and well and remain vigilant and active in this fight against extremism and terrorism in our country and for the rest of the world. This has truly been an informative, enlightening, and really inspiring session as we move forward in trying to build a more resilient country and world for all of us. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, sirs.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Brother.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Again, for the questions that were left unanswered in the chat, we will try our best efforts to reach out to our speakers and concerned resource persons to address them and send them back to you in the email that you shared with us. So for more information about future webinars, please follow Security Matters, or you can email us at events@securitymatters.com.ph. As mentioned by Sir Ace earlier, we can look forward to part 2 of this seminar. The challenge for information sharing and constantly learning from the past remains. So we look forward to getting you on board as well for the next installment of our webinar.
Thank you, Wally.
Thank you, Major General Ferro.
Aro, congrats. No, wala.
Thank you, sir.